listeners. Welcome back to the podcast. I am your host, Jeff Miller. Did want to start off by saying we had put out a post, but our condolences to the victims of Air India Flight 171, the 787 that crashed in India inbound to London right off of departure. I'm sure everybody has seen the videos online and a lot of speculation running back and forth on actually what happened to that aircraft. It's always very difficult in our industry when a tragedy like this happens. They did recover the cockpit voice recorder and also the flight data recorder. So hopefully we will be able to get to the bottom of what happened here and learn from that lesson as we mourn and try to find answers to avoid future accidents. But obviously, at a time like this where those things happen, it's always nice to at least talk to a friendly voice. And I couldn't be happier in that front to talk with my good friend, Alex Gertsen. Alex and I had met a while back now, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we get into the episode here. But Alex right now works for the National Business Aviation Association, and I will let Alex talk a little bit further about what he does and how he does it. Now, I got so engrossed talking to Alex, we ended up spending about 2 hours together on the podcast. So I actually broke this up into two segments. So you'll hear it stop here at the end, and then we'll do our usual kind of wrap up. And then keeping in mind that we will be coming back to discuss with Alex the following week to finish up his interview. So without further ado, we will get into the conversation with Alex Gertsen. Well, as I alluded to, we're here with our guest, Alex Gertsen with NBAA. Alex, welcome to Destination Aviation.
It's great to be here, Jeff. Thank you for having me on the show. It's such a privilege.
No, I mean, to have someone of your stature to be on our show, quite honestly, it's all my privilege. I've known you for, how long now? Probably close to a decade, around that?
I would say so.
Not intimately that long, though.
Yeah. Well, yeah, exactly. I feel like we really got to know each other with some really good Italian food, and that was just a few years ago, more recently, when you took the time to come to D.C. and take the time to spend time together.
Well, you were so gracious to invite me out there, and you shared some of your story. I love that. Love some of your insights that you have into the industry and where we're at, and what is business aviation, what is the importance of having an association dedicated to advocating for the industry like you do with the National Business Aviation Association, or NBAA as people in our industry know it. Maybe some of our listeners probably don't know that, but do you want to touch on that at all, Alex, up here up front, about what your role is and what you're doing here, kind of the double threat to aviation?
I appreciate that. That's a great way to refer to it. I'm fortunate to have an advocacy position in Washington, D.C., as you mentioned, advocating on behalf of business aviation, as well as to actually do a little bit of work in business aviation as a professional pilot, doing contract piloting, flying charters and organ flights to augment what I see at my desk, to also, so to speak, have a view from the flight deck on our industry and keep the pulse on that.
I love that. So often, in my day job, I think sometimes I feel a little disconnected from aviation. So every time I get to go flying, I kind of remember the purpose of why we do the things that we do.
Exactly. It's looking at your office from the air as you speed down the runway at Chicago Executive and have that perspective.
There's nothing quite like that feeling, isn't it? When you've done all your pre-checks, you're ready to go, and you're sitting there at the runway, and you're lined up, and you put that throttle in. And there's nothing like it. I love it so much.
Absolutely. So maybe for your listeners, if they're not familiar with what business aviation is, to shed some light on that. Essentially, any aircraft traveling with the purpose of conducting business is a business aviation aircraft. And it can be a typical corporate jet that people might think about. It can be a small turboprop. it can be a piston propeller airplane traveling with that purpose. Also, vertical aviation is a big part of that, helicopters, and we'll touch on later, hopefully, talking about electric vertical takeoff and landing aircraft that are on the horizon. Also, moving equipment, moving cargo, talking about moving organs, all of that is part of business aviation. So these aircraft can be flown by professional crews where you have two pilots working together. Some people might be familiar from what we see in the airline world, or they can be flown by single pilot. In fact, that's quite prevalent. And a lot of the flying that I do is both crewed and single pilot.
No, that's fantastic. I think maybe for the listeners, because one, I really want to talk about your role with the National Business Aviation Association, but maybe we could go through some of your career highlights, what brought you to this point with NBAA, and then we can talk about NBAA and what you're doing now. So I don't know if you're comfortable just starting at the beginning, how you got into aviation, why you got into it, and go through some of your past and to where we are now with NBAA.
Absolutely. I have a unique story, but maybe not so unique as a lot of us have been exposed to aviation shortly after birth and had the opportunity to get bitten by the bug, as we say in the industry. I was fortunate that both my mom and my grandfather were in aviation. My grandfather was in the Air Force, and my mom was an engineer working at the computing center for a major airline.
Wow. What airline was that?
It was Aeroflot.
I was wondering if that's what the airline was. I didn't know that.
So I grew up, a big part of my life was spent in the former Soviet Union.
Okay.
And my grandfather, when he retired from the Air Force, he was assigned housing on base where he last worked. And so it's very typical. After you're born, you get dropped off with your grandparents, and you're there until about 2 or 3 until you start what's referred to in Russia as kindergarten. A little bit different ages, or when we start kindergarten in the U.S.
Really? So from the ages 2 to 3, you're kind of raised by your grandparents.
From 0 to 3, I spent a lot of time with my grandparents.
Wow. Okay.
While my parents worked full time.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways I do love that, because so often you get later in life that you wish you were able to spend more time with your grandparents. And so, do you remember a lot of that time period, at that age, or is it kind of a blur for like all of us?
No, I remember it very vividly.
You
and
do?
I remember
Okay.
early on, and obviously I continued to spend time with my grandparents in their apartment and spending time on the Air Force Base. And I got to learn that sound is delayed. And so if the apartment building starts to vibrate with a formation of MiGs flying over it, and you want to see it, you've got to run to the window as soon as you feel the vibration, not when you hear the sound. Because if you hear the sound, you're going to miss it.
I love that. Wow.
And I knew exactly where to look and where to find them in the sky.
Wow, that has to be such a special memory to actually see a MiG in flight too, especially during that time period, probably, right? I would assume a lot of secrecy around the MiG, right? And you just get to run over to the window and see it.
Yeah, and I was kind of on the inside. With my grandparents on the Air Force Base. And what was cool is whenever they would have air shows, my grandfather would take me, and then we'd walk and visit the aircraft. And they would be roped off, to your point. And then somebody would recognize my grandfather and say, "Oh my gosh, you're back. This must be your grandson." And they would turn to me and say, "Hey, would you like to go in the cockpit?" And of course, I very quickly learned to say, "Absolutely."
Wow. So you actually got to get in the cockpit of a MiG.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes. Many times. And of course, at that point, in the back of my mind, I knew that I wanted to be a pilot. But then I would also visit my mom at work and see all the important work that she was doing from the engineering perspective, from the computing perspective, and the technology that went into flying. And then my family also had flight benefits. It was very unique. Most people in the former Soviet Union at the time would travel by train. It was costly to fly, but we had flight benefits, so we would go on a lot of vacation flying. And I had a chance to experience commercial flying very early on.
Wow, I love that.
Kind of put all of that together.
No, that's an amazing story. I've been reading a book by Dan Pedersen, and he started the Top Gun flight school. And part of, I guess unbeknownst now, it's public in his book, but they had a captured MiG that they kept out of Area 51, and they would go out there and train with it. And it's just amazing to me that, and it makes sense, right? But that you got, because even here, like thinking about, someone younger getting in an F-15 or something, but that you actually got to sit in that, and your parents' journey there. That's amazing. That's awesome.
Yeah, as a very unique experience. I was fortunate that my family was able to leave the Soviet Union before its downfall, and that we were able to make our way to the United States.
Now, I don't know if you want to talk about it, but I know you've mentioned in the past when we had that nice Italian food in Washington, D.C., I loved your story there, and I think, if you don't mind sharing, I think it was through Italy, is that correct, when you came to America?
Great memory, yes. At the time, the path was not direct. You didn't get on the plane in Moscow and land somewhere in the U.S. We actually flew from Moscow to Vienna and spent some time in Austria, and then quite a bit of time in Italy, about 6 months. Italy at the time was very gracious to host a lot of immigrants from the Soviet Union, and acted as an Ellis Island at the time, where you got all your paperwork in order. If you were an adult, I wasn't quite 18 yet, you had to go through some medical testing to make sure that you were healthy, that you didn't have any issues coming into the U.S., so that by the time we landed at JFK, it was just a quick stamp through immigration and welcome to the United States.
Wow. Now, you had mentioned, too, that you helped your family out, right, by cleaning windshields at vehicles. Is this correct, that we're at railroad crossings?
Yes. It was a challenging time financially, because when we left the Soviet Union, we were not able to take out very much money. The government limited how much money you could take out. So we left with $360 in our pockets. We could only exchange $90 equivalent per person, and we were a family of 4. And so while there were charitable organizations that supported us in Italy, the per diem that we got was minimal. Rent was expensive, food was expensive. And so everyone had some kind of a job. And even though I was 12, I found a way to contribute. I saw a number of immigrant kids from the community going out to the railroads, and you invest in a brush and a squeegee bottle, and now you can make some money.
And the community kind of accepted you there, right? At first, if I'm remembering incorrectly, you tell me, but at first you kind of had to assimilate into the community, and like, oh, it's Alex, and Alex is going. This is his area to clean windshields, right? Because there was some folks that they did that themselves, right? Like, that would clean windshields, and you had to kind of gain the trust of the local community. Am I remembering that correctly? Maybe I'm not.
No, it's a great recollection. So that was part of it. Obviously, it's very competitive because there are only so many cars that stop at a railroad crossing, and it's closed for a limited period of time while the train is passing. So ultimately, it's nice to be accepted into that group of boys who went out and were cleaning windows. But ultimately, the bigger boys kind of got first dibs, and then you run to the back of the line, and if you can get some cars in the back of the line, great. Sometimes there weren't enough cars that would stop, and so railroad would close and train would pass, and I didn't get a chance to wash any windows.
It's funny, when you first told me that, I was thinking on it on the way back, and I was confused in my own mind at the beginning, because for some reason I thought you were cleaning the windows on the rail cars, like on the passenger rail cars, and I was like, how did he do that? Was he like hanging off of it? And then I was like, oh wait, he probably meant the cars.
Yes, the automobiles.
Well, that's great. So then you found yourself in the United States after that, is that correct?
That's correct. So then find myself in the United States, and I was fortunate that my family was sponsored by a community in South Florida in Boca Raton. We were one of the 30 families from the Soviet Union that were able to resettle there. And Boca has a very nice airport, very vibrant aviation community there as well. It was a great place to grow up.
No, I'm there's so many questions I could ask. I mean, I'm still on the MiG thing, but I was going to say up front though. So for you coming from Russia, now I'm assuming that you'll be like, wait a minute, Jeff doesn't know anything about geography. Is most of Russia generally? I mean, I know summertime obviously is different, but most of that is it more similar to the Midwest temperature-wise in Russia? I mean, is there really not too many, let's say, like Florida destinations within Russia?
There are, and
there are.
Okay. When I mentioned with traveling on vacation, we'd go to the Black Sea.
Okay.
And that was maybe not quite as warm and as tropical as Florida.
Okay.
But it was warm, and you could swim, and you could enjoy being on the beach and enjoying the Black Sea.
So moving to Florida maybe wasn't as much of a culture shock as maybe in my mind I was thinking, because you were used to the temperature, or how was that, assimilating into Florida? Did you find it to be easy? Did you love it? What?
Moving from Moscow to Florida was both a big culture shock and a big climate shock.
Okay.
For sure. It was nothing like where we lived and what we experienced. And of course, mentioned that we had a limited amount of money when we left. We also were limited to how much luggage we could bring with us. And so we were very strategic when we packed. And when we left the Soviet Union, we didn't know where in the U.S. we would end up. We could have ended up in Chicago, where you are. In fact, my dad had a close friend who we thought could sponsor us. We later found out that he wasn't eligible, so we could have ended up in Chicago.
That might have been similar to Moscow.
Maybe on certain days, but I think Moscow is much colder.
Is it? Okay.
Even then, yeah. It's probably more closer to some of the cities in Canada.
Okay.
In terms of the climate and the harshness of it, but we had a whole suitcase of winter clothes that we could never really use or never really needed.
Right.
But ultimately, my mom, when she saw the palm trees and she saw the beautiful weather, she said, if I never see snow again in my life, I could be okay with that.
And did she? Did she ever see snow?
She did. We made some trips out of Florida, but ultimately she did not have to shovel it or clean it off cars, all those types of things that we in the northern climates have the privilege of doing.
Oh, I love that. So now you're in Florida. What age were you when you moved to Florida?
12.
12 years old. Okay. So you started school in Florida, and you now at that point, were your parents, were they able to stay in the aviation industry in the U.S. or?
They were not, actually. Okay. My mom had also an interest in going into the medical field.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And so when we came to the U.S., she was able to pursue that. My dad was a doctor, and it took him many years to fully get his license as a dentist. But ultimately, he ended up pursuing that career path.
Wow. Did your father stay flying at all? I mean, for recreation, or did he hang it up when he got to the States?
My grandfather.
Your grandfather flew. I'm sorry. Okay, so your father wasn't. He wasn't.
No.
So your mom worked for. I'll butcher Aeroflot. Is that correct?
Aeroflot. Yes, exactly. Aeroflot. And my grandfather was the one who was in the Air Force, but he was not a pilot.
He was okay. So you're 12 years old. You're going to school, and you have the aviation bug, right?
Oh, absolutely. And I was fortunate that once I started high school, my high school was right on the approach path to the Boca Raton Airport.
Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah.
It was built as a typical Florida school where the buildings aren't connected, and you actually leave the classroom and end up going outside to go in between classes.
Okay. Okay, yeah. Well, I mean, I guess in Florida you're all right doing that, right? You can transfer outside
Oh,
afterwards.
absolutely. A lot of times you couldn't wait to go outside because it was so cold inside with the
Oh.
AC running.
I love that. So you're going to high school there. When did you start pilot training? Was that right around that high school age, or?
I actually did not start flight training until after college, believe
Okay.
it or not.
I was the
Um,
same. I was after college when I started flight training.
it was kind of everything came together. I had the opportunity to fly, and I also, most importantly, had the means to support it.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think that's so much like part of the you know when you people talk because when I got into this, right, it's like, oh, I would love to fly almost immediately, right? Like I would love to do that, and then you start looking at what it costs to fly, and you're like, well, maybe I can't do that right away. And so it took me actually until I was working in California to where in my career I was able to say, hey, you know what? I think I can finally afford to do this, and so. It's somewhat of a similar trajectory, at least with the pilot training part of it. And actually, when I moved to Florida as well, but I at the time couldn't flight train. So when you were there, and I say it both ways. I say Boca Raton sometimes, but it's Boca Raton. You're correct, right? You're
Yes,
from there, so I'm
yes.
going to go with the way you're saying it. But you were so when you were going to college there, did you flight train at the airport in Boca or?
I did not. So I ended up coming up to DC
Okay,
on a high school trip.
okay,
And I remember being a young boy in Moscow
okay.
and have very vivid memories of driving through the streets of Moscow with my dad. And we were listening to the radio. And the newscaster comes on and says, today the White House announced, and they talked about what the president was doing. But as a young boy, I remember asking my father and saying, what does this mean? How can the White House announce something? And then learning that it was not just the building, but it stood for something. And so in high school, 1994,
I was going to ask who was president. Now I know,
yes,
Mr. Clinton.
yes, Bill Clinton was president, and Pennsylvania Avenue was still open to traffic, just so that the listeners can kind of get the perspective. As you're walking down there, it's not the closed street like it is now. It's full of cars. And I remember standing in front of the White House and looking at it and remembering going from the streets of Moscow to now being on Pennsylvania Avenue. But what really intrigued me, seeing people walk in and out, was would it look like being on the inside and looking to the outside uh, from there.
Wow, I love that. You know
And
what's
interestingly enough,
yeah.
yeah,
No, go ahead. No, I'm
I was
listening.
going to say,
Yeah.
interestingly enough, I took that dream and made it a goal. And part of that, to making that a reality, was coming to college in Washington, D.C.
So, where you like what I guess I was getting at earlier is you pilot train later in life, but obviously you didn't go back to Boca for that. You moved to Washington, and that's later in life. So you learned to train outside the D.C. area.
Correct. I did. I wanted to give a shout out to my home airport in Boca Raton. I did take some flight training when I would come home.
Okay. Okay.
From there for sure. But my primary flight training was in the D.C. area at a small airport called Davis. Whiskey 50 is the identifier.
Whiskey 50. Okay. Whiskey 5. Now I'm assuming Whiskey 50 is still there.
It's still there.
Good. Good.
The runway has been extended, but at the time it had a 2,000-foot runway.
Wow.
But it was perfect because
Yeah.
I was training in the Cessna 150.
Oh yeah, yeah. That's plenty of runway. You probably do a couple touch and goes.
Plenty of runway that got you to be really precise.
I
because
bet.
it was only 25 feet wide.
Now, was that I'm sure uncontrolled field, but was that under any airspace shelves there, or were you too far out for that?
That's a great question. So when I first started, I went to a number of airports doing discovery flights, as most of us do when we
Yeah.
get into flight training and are serious about pursuing it. And I came to Davis. We just took off, didn't have to talk to anybody, had a beautiful flight. It's just on the outskirts of the suburbia of DC, where you're flying over beautiful fields in Maryland,
Wow.
cornfields, and There's a cement plant that you go to. That's the practice area.
Okay, that's a good practice area. Nobody's going to be complaining on the ground over a cement plant.
Sure, but ultimately that was July of 2001.
Oh,
And
okay.
how all of that changed. At the same time, worked through a couple of curveballs at me. As we talk later, I'll explain what those were. But ultimately, when I came back and resumed my flight training, it was in 2003. And not only did we have to talk to somebody, but we had to file a flight plan.
Really?
At the time, it was called the Air Defense Identification Zone. It's called the ADIZ.
Oh, yeah. Okay, yeah. Yep. Uh-huh.
And then ultimately that got finalized with a rule and became the Special Flight Rules Area, or the SFRA, as most of us refer to it now.
Wow. So, yeah, that's definitely, you learned a lot of lessons quickly there about that type of airspace. I learned to fly. So I finished in Indiana, but I started in Reed, Hillview, California. And so that's class Delta, but San Jose's class Charlie's just to the north. And you're under the shelf for the class Bravo with San Francisco. And so it did make kind of the similar here to Chicago Executive Airport. I always felt that it makes, a well-rounded pilot because you're used to talking to, towers and TRACONs and control centers or route traffic control centers. And so, to me, it always kind of makes a more well-rounded pilot, I think. And in your case,
absolutely,
with everything that you had to do outside D.C. Now, when you said you made it a reality, back to your workflow of working at the White House. So I was going to mention briefly, 1994, I don't know if our paths crossed, but it was the first time I went to Washington, D.C., and I stood in front of the White House and looked in. Now I didn't have the thought that you did of looking at it. It was awe-inspiring. You took it and ran with it, which congratulations for that. But maybe our paths cross ways. Who knows?
Could be.
Busy streets at DC.
And it's funny that you're talking about paths crossing, and you mentioned Reed Hillview. I was at Reed Hillview virtually earlier today, attending their RTAC.
Oh, wow.
From the Safety Action Team meeting, yeah?
Yeah, I still get some emails here and there from folks that own businesses, and, it's one of those airports, too. I know you guys at NBAA have been working a lot to protect Reed Hillview and the right for people to fly in and out of there. So, one, I appreciate everything that you guys do on the advocacy front for pilots in that area, because I know as, me training there, that airport serves a lot of good stuff. A lot of stuff we talk about with you today, they do it at that airport.
Absolutely.
So I do have a fondness for it in my heart, as it was not a young Jeff Miller, but a middle-aged, maybe somewhere Jeff Miller learning to fly. And there was that mall. There's that mall right before you come in and approach there, because if I remember right, they have parallels, maybe 3 threes, is it? Yeah. Or 3 ones. But the mall would give you a little lift from probably our friends at Thorough Dynamics and Wind Shear. When you would come in, there was such a huge area for parking, and then I don't know if the wind or the heat coming off the asphalt, but you'd get a little push up every time you'd come in, and you just kind of learned to expect it when you were flight training. But,
yeah, very cool.
But you find yourself at the White House. Is that correct? Where are we at in your career, Alex? You're in D.C. You said you alluded to the listeners that you wanted to be behind the bars, and not in jail, I mean, but behind the White House bars.
Yes, looking out from the inside of the fence, not
yes.
That's
a better way to put it.
Yes, and so I find myself in college at the George Washington University, and found a way into the White House. It's very typical for GW students to do some kind of an internship or some kind of a job in DC, something outside of academics, because ultimately that was the real value that the university provided, being the campus, for those who may not know, is right downtown DC. There is no fence. Ultimately, you're waiting for lights to change as you cross streets to go from between classes.
Wow.
It's a very cool urban campus, but it's only about 2 blocks away from some of the buildings from the White House.
Did you decide to go to George Washington because you're wanting to work in the White House? Was that your ultimate? Is that why you chose that university because you would be close to where you ultimately saw your goal?
I was excited that I could be in the nation's capital.
Wow.
And to be in an urban setting. I missed being in Moscow. We lived right downtown, and so I missed that aspect of it living in Florida. So I thought that would be a great college experience. But also I thought there's a glimmer of hope that that's something I might be able to do. And if I'm geographically positioned closer to it, that makes it possible.
That makes a lot of sense. So you're close to the White House, and you said a lot of students would gain internships with the White House?
They would gain internships various areas in Washington, D.C.
Okay.
There's lots of opportunities, people interested in different areas. But I was fortunate that I was able to find something in aviation at the White House.
And what was that?
A lot of people may not realize, but the White House has a travel office.
Okay. You mean for people in the cabinet and actually traveling from the White House, or different? Am I thinking of this in a different way?
Think about it in a different way. Think about the entire entourage that travels with the president. So you have the military aircraft that carry the president. You had a great podcast on Air Force One.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah. So I encourage your listeners to go and listen to it because it has a lot of history and a lot of really interesting details on how those aircraft operate. But then also, especially at the time, there was a lot of press corps that would travel with the president, staff, as well as Secret Service and other support. And they all traveled on a charter aircraft. So the ultimate in business aviation. And the travel office coordinated all that.
I'm sure that was no easy task, considering your bosses. And I don't mean that in any one particular legislative body, just being in this long enough, as at least in my case, the travel plans they change at the whim, and rightfully so. I mean, these people have a lot of places to go, so I would assume that's a challenging job. Just you're probably juggling a lot there to keep logistics moving in the right direction. Is it safe to understand that maybe that's how, and probably at this point less resources, right, to do this? I mean, obviously this would have been around 2003. You said 2001, 2003.
No, this was the late '90s. So Clinton left the White House in 2001.
Okay, so the pilot training was around 2001, 2003. The internship was late '90s.
Correct. Yes,
Okay.
It was while I was in college, from '97 through 2001.
Okay. And so the tools available to you with Windows 95.
Yes, Windows 95, Windows NT at the office, very good. Fax machines. In fact, fax machines helped me gain more responsibility because there were certain interns in the office who were very sloppy with them. But those who use the fax machine, essentially, maybe some people don't even know in the podcast what it is, but it's basically a scanner and an emailer all at once, but it has to go to another machine that can decipher it. So through the phone line. So essentially, you put a piece of paper on the machine, you type in the phone number where you're sending it, you have to wait for it to get scanned, you have to wait for it to get transmitted if you're really diligent.
Yeah.
And a number of interns, volunteers would throw it on there, walk away, and then all of a sudden, 5 hours later, one of the trip coordinators gets a call from the charter broker and says, "Hey, I thought you wanted to lock in this aircraft. I haven't received the contract, and the deadline is almost up." And I said, "Oh, we faxed this in the morning," and then walk over to the fax machine and. At the end, the fax machine would typically spit out a page that would say transmission okay, or would say NG no go, meaning it got a busy number or somehow it got interrupted. And if you weren't diligent when you were asked to send a fax, it could make a big impact to the operation.
Oh yeah, no, it's funny because for me too. I mean, I grew up in fax machines as well. And it still mystifies me. I know listeners will probably be like, "Oh, that sounds like so antiquated," but that you could send, like, back even now, that I could write you something and fax it, and it's whatever I sent, through zeros and ones through the phone system, and it looks
Right.
exactly. Again, and it's interesting because, I think, here, like, a lot of airports, right? You go through your old guiding documents, and you see, facsimiles and these things written on there. But it is the technology, somewhat, I don't know if short lived is the right, but in my time with it, somewhat short lived. But yeah, I same as you. I'd always be diligent. Whenever I faxed something, I would wait to get the confirmation that it got where it needed to go, and I would put that with the original fax. So whoever was double checking, and because sometimes people, I never got it. Well, yeah, you did.
Right.
At least it says it went.
At least it says it went through. Exactly. So yeah, so my job was not political. It was logistics, as you describe it. And you're right, it was challenging, but ultimately it's business aviation. That's what business aviation is good at. Yeah. Traveling from point to point, not from point to hub to another point as airlines do. And this was prevalent in the United States when the president would travel, and around the world, where you could go and visit 5 countries in 2 or 3 days and make the trip with all the gear that the press had to carry, go from place to place. The press were able to arrive early and be there in time for just a few hours early.
Sure.
To be there to cover the president's event. And then they were able to stay a little bit later. What you see on TV, a lot of the stand-ups afterwards talking about president's visit or the meetings that took place. They were able to do that and then jump on the plane and catch up with the president for the next stop and the next stop and the next stop. And we made all of that happen in the travel office.
Wow. And so, because like on your side to that, right? I mean, obviously the press corps, so I'm sure a lot of the same characters that would fly, but I would just assume too the logistical side to it. I would, because it's government paid charter, they probably, these networks and stuff, reimburse for their travel to.
That
you have to deal with all
correct.
That too?
That's correct. The press corps
Okay.
pays for all the travel, and
Okay.
the travel office facilitates the collections and the billing. All that was a big part of it, and I learned very early on how to be responsible with collecting the billing and keeping track of it all.
Yeah.
That was part of the responsibility. I was fortunate that once I've had a chance to prove myself in the office and in DC, I had the opportunity to start traveling ahead of the president, what's called being part of an advance team, getting there 5 to 10 days ahead of time, depending on the complexity of the trip, and setting up these trips domestically and around the world. I've had a chance to travel to some really amazing places. Wow. I had a chance to go to some really cool airports and be on the GA side and set up for these press charters to arrive, work with customs, immigration, work with airport ops and all the logistics, all of this ones that we know well, that you and others who have received presidential entourages have experienced.
Yeah, no, I love that. I mean, in my mind, you could correct me here, but I think during that period, so we had Reagan and then, George H. Bush, then to Clinton. During the Clinton years, if I remember that time period, there was this kind of normalization at that point now with Russia. Did you get to travel back to your home country during that time period on an official visit?
That is a great question. I did. It was a real privilege. So,
I bet. That's amazing.
I was fortunate that I got my citizenship in 1996, and that happened in July. And then in September, I walked into the White House and said, "Hey, I want to work here." Of the same year, pretty cool. And then in the year 2000, almost exactly 10 years after we left the Soviet Union, I landed at the same airport that we departed from, and I was really proud to show my official passport.
I love that.
And to the immigrations officer and say, "Hey, I'm an American now," walking in.
And I would assume, too, that at that point, I mean, even now, you probably have friends and relatives that still live in Russia, right? So would you be able to kind of have a little homecoming when you went there?
I have friends. Most of the relatives,
Okay.
interestingly enough, also have immigrated.
Okay.
And I
Okay.
have really close friends who I went to elementary school with and have close friendships with that I did get to see.
Okay. That's great. That's great. I mean, that's amazing. I mean, to see from kind of your vision of where you wanted to go in life. I mean, I can imagine. So you would have been on one of the advanced aircraft, right? And then kind of coordinating an official presidential arrival into Moscow. Is that correct?
Exactly. I
Wow.
arrived just on a commercial flight
Wow.
and spent about 10 days or so preparing and then facilitating the trip. Then I stayed a little bit longer, visited with friends, and then headed back to the U.S.
Wow, I love that. And so at that point, that was 2000. So that was the kind of the end of the Clinton era, right? George W. was taking over, and your internship ceased at that point. You didn't continue on into George W. Bush's administration, correct?
That's correct. So ultimately, I ended up kind of being more of a volunteer status rather than an intern. Just more of a technical term about how things are classified at the White House. The volunteer position is nice because it allowed me to do that all 4 years throughout college, and essentially, you're in the computer. You show up, show ID, and then you get your badge that has a V versus an intern would have an I
Okay.
um, at the time. And then when I traveled, I would be what they call traveling staff, almost like a contract staff, where you get issued a White House cell phone pagers at the time were really prevalent. I
Yep.
don't even know what those are.
Pager to
Um,
make sure your fax went through.
yeah, radios, all those things. And then as soon as Air Force One was wheels up, you turn all of that in and you become back to
Wow.
being a regular citizen. I graduated college in May of 2000, and so I had an opportunity to actually work on staff for a little bit of time between then and January 20th when Clinton left office. But at that point, I was a political appointee, and so the whole team does transition. The staff in the travel office did transition.
Sure. No, that makes a lot of sense. And then at that point, that's when you started, right? Because you started before 9/11 your pilot training, correct? And then
Exactly,
yeah.
exactly. And then from the White House, I followed my passion for technology. I was fortunate that in high school, I had a really great computer science teacher who got to know me really well and suggested that I was really excited about aviation and being a pilot. I was also probably just as excited about computers who were becoming prevalent and becoming part of everything. Internet was just becoming a thing. And so he encouraged me to study computer science in college and then combine my two passions. And I could not have done that more perfectly going into Lockheed Martin, Air Traffic Management Division, right after I finished at the White House in the spring of 2001.
It's funny because another like kind of parallel there to your lives with your to the high school where you had the teacher really kind of talk to you about software and technology. But I know people laugh about it, but there is some truth behind Al Gore, which would have been your White House experience, right? Inventing the internet. But I do know he spurred a lot of legislation, right, to really make it public. I think is that I know there's people go back and forth on that, but I think that the reality behind it though is he really did try to push to open up the internet, right? Is that
Certainly, the administration was supportive of that technology at the time.
that's fair?
But ultimately, yeah, I ended up at Lockheed Martin, and I was working on developing air traffic control software.
Okay.
And my first project was working for the UK air traffic control system.
Really? Wow. So
Yeah.
you moved across the pond then, back? Or
No, it was all
stayed?
done in Rockville, Maryland, in the suburb of
Really?
DC,
Wow.
developing software for NATS, National Air Traffic Services, which is the entity that runs air traffic in the UK. And Lockheed was contracted to develop software for the center in Swanwick, and then a second center in Scotland.
Wow.
And interestingly enough, that was my first encounter with ATC privatization.
Oh yeah. Okay. Yeah. And how
So
did
we,
that how'd that work on your front? And how did you view that?
So interestingly enough, at the time, NATS privatized.
Yeah.
And very quickly they looked at their contracts and said, hey, wait a second, the center in Scotland still works. I don't think we need to spend hundreds of millions of dollars modernizing it quite yet. Let's cancel the Lockheed contract.
Okay.
And so I was, for a period of time, supposed to go over to the UK once the work on the Scottish Center would have started transitioning from the en route center to the new Scottish Center, as they called it. But ultimately, I ended up transitioning to Atlantic City. Which is where the FAA.
Yeah, it's kind of the test bed, right?
Control, the technical center is.
Yep.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so that explains a little break that I had to take in my flight training.
No, that makes so. And I'm going to claim to be naive here on the private. So the system there in Scotland was it privatized when you started with Lockheed there, or was there the thought to privatize it while you were working there? How? And I apologize, I actually don't know. Is it privatized now? Is it not privatized? Or
it's privatized now, and the privatization happened while I was working at Lockheed.
Okay.
And so my first experience was that essentially the contract that I was supposed to be on was canceled.
Yeah. Okay.
As the result of that, and the modernization did not happen as quickly.
Is that something that the government was handing it over was it not there? The transition kind of snuck up. I guess I'm trying to understand why they would enter into a contract to update things, or was it, politicians, legislators changed over in the governing bodies there, and they decided, hey, let's privatize this, or how did you get a contract, and then in the middle of it they kind of decided let's privatize?
The contract was given many years ago.
Okay, so you were
and it was from multiple centers.
Okay.
One at first, exactly,
okay.
and then the second one. And so when the privatization happened, the private entity just decided not to continue with that effort.
Okay.
At the time.
Yeah, because here, I'm more probably localized. I hear a lot, obviously, about the privatization in Canada, but I wasn't aware Scotland and how things were working there, or how they view privatization. I'm sure we could talk all day long between U.S. and Canada's airspace systems, but generally speaking, has it been working, the privatization of it over there? Or is there issues within the system?
I think we see challenges in all the systems,
yeah,
but ultimately, NBAA's position is, for the U.S., the government-operated system is the right system, because we have the most complex system in the world. Nobody has as many flights and as many operations, as much general aviation operations.
Absolutely. Yeah,
as we do here.
It's interesting. When I worked in Laredo, Texas, because I think myself, I take a lot of it for granted in the U.S., but we would have a lot of flight school operators that would come up from Mexico to train in the U.S. because it's a fair system, right? If you want to shoot an ILS, whatever it might be, whatever your training goals are.
Right.
But in Mexico, they if you were flight training, there were times they'd be like, no, there's commercial airliners, so you can go back to the ramp, and so a lot of times people weren't able to get the experience to be proficient pilots, and so they would come to the U.S. to learn. And so a lot of times I try to remind myself that we have such an amazing system, and it is amazing that really anybody, including both of us, that want to learn to fly in this country can, and it's such a privilege. But you find yourself,
absolutely,
yeah,
absolutely, and NBAA fights very hard for that.
You do, you
absolutely. Back in the 2017,
yeah.
2018 timeframe,
yeah,
we were out front fighting the privatization effort here in the United States.
Yeah. And
we succeeded in preserving the current system. But ultimately,
absolutely. A debt of gratitude from all the pilots out there to your advocacy there. So you find yourself in Atlantic City, the test bed for the FAA.
Yeah. I got to work on some of the latest and greatest systems for the FAA. I've got a chance to go to a number of en route centers and deploy them, and then ultimately return back to Rockville, Maryland, where the headquarters for that division of Lockheed Martin was. And through the leadership program, I had a chance to rotate into the business development division.
And that's within Lockheed?
Of the unit. Within Lockheed, within Lockheed Air Traffic Management.
Wow.
And that was one of the coolest things that I've done, because ultimately, one, it allowed me to slightly branch away from engineering, but essentially still continue to build on it because I was working for a technology company. But it also allowed me to work on flight service station outsourcing. Now, a lot of us may remember that flight service stations were part of the FAA.
Yep.
And around the 2004 timeframe, the government looked at outsourcing them. And Lockheed bid on that effort. I had a chance to be very much involved in developing the technology, developing the solutions for it, while I was flight training, while I was then working on my instrument rating, having a great perspective on how pilots can receive better services. Now, again, we talked about fax machines. This was back in the day. If you were to walk into the flight service station at the FAA, the briefer would be looking at a screen with black background and green letters. They didn't have all the fancy mapping and visualization that we do now, and that we're also really spoiled to have on our iPads and with ADS-B on the flight deck. So all of that was part of the modernization effort. I've had a chance to lead that. But even more importantly, my team was also tasked to look at what other areas of aviation outside of air traffic management could Lockheed's technologies be relevant to. And one of the areas that we identified was airports. And so I got very much involved in the American Association of Airport Executives, or as we lovingly refer to the acronym AAAE.
Yes, yes.
And started working on various initiatives like low-cost surface surveillance, runway safety, and ultimately got to know a lot of airports and really fell in love with what airports represent and how little resources airports have and how these technology companies like Lockheed could help.
Who were some of the giants you'd say that you worked with at AAAE?
So ultimately, after Lockheed, I had the opportunity to transition to AAA and actually join the staff.
Yeah.
And some of the giants I got to work with were people like Robert Ollislagers. He was a major influencer in general aviation. He was the executive director and CEO at Centennial Airport, one of the busiest business aviation airports in the United States. And at the time that I started at AAAE and was tasked with helping grow the professional opportunities for general aviation airport managers, we started the General Aviation Airports Committee. We started the conference, and Robert was a big champion behind that. I was fortunate to have a chance to work with him.
Yeah. Did he host the first year of that conference?
That's right. He hosted the first year in Denver at Centennial. I also got to work with Henry Grzinski. He was the president and CEO of NASAO, National Association of State Aviation Officials.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's just Henry O, as people lovingly refer to him. I learned a lot from him and how we approach different challenges, the way that he would bring everyone together. Bill Dunn worked at AOPA at the time, and he was the lead for airport advocacy. And through him, I really got to see the importance of doing that. Speaking of Reed Hillview, Bill Dunn played a huge role in saving Reed Hillview.
Yes.
He played a huge role in saving Albert Whitted Airport in St. Petersburg. Unfortunately, the three giants who I mentioned all were lost too soon to cancer. They're not with us. Yeah. I also got to work with some people who are still very much in the industry. One of them was Tom Zoller. Tom worked on Capitol Hill and then spent time at the FAA as chief of staff to then Administrator Jane Garvey. And he came over to AAAE as vice president of regulatory affairs. Became a mentor for me, and he was the one who encouraged me to transition to AAA and really showed me how, through my passion for flying, and at that point, I had both my private pilot certificate as well as the instrument rating. I just bought my first airplane, a Mooney M20C.
Wow.
And I could really travel and visit the airport professionals who we were encouraging to become more active members in AAA, see the airports from airside versus arriving landside. Because if you're not flying yourself, there is no way to arrive airside at a GA airport.
Right. You really immersed yourself into general aviation there. I love that.
Incredibly so.
Yeah, no. And I know, so we have a lot of people that listen that aren't necessarily in the aviation field. I know we've bounced a couple acronyms here, and I'm excited to talk about this. But I would say the American Association of Airport Executives, and you tell me because you work for both, but between NBAA and AAAE, AAAE I would say is more focused on airports and airport perspective development. NBAA, while airports are part of it, I think you're more encompassing and look more towards the flight operator perspective. But I would love to hear how you compare the two, just so people, as we're going through acronyms, don't get confused on where you're at, what you're doing at the time. But how would you describe AAAE versus NBAA and kind of your advocacy in both those roles?
It's a great question. I think our listeners would be excited to know that I think we have close to like 500 associations in Washington, D.C. If you have a profession or an industry or a niche, there's an association that represents you. And for those who have faced challenging problems facing the industry, you realize how important that is, both for coming together and having representation on Capitol Hill, in our case, regulatory in front of the FAA and other executive departments, as well as professionally, to help you grow professionally in terms of AAA offers a certification for those who enter the industry in many different areas, both the CM, the various flavors of ACE.
Yes.
By the way, we should put a plug in for those who are listening, because ACE, General Aviation Airports, is about to come online.
Okay.
Yes.
I love that.
First class is going to be in the fall, sometime in November.
Did you play a hand in kind of crafting what that looks like? With
I have not.
Okay.
Jeff Coleman with Aviation Management Consulting Group
Great.
has been the leader on that. But I do hope to be in the first class to get the certification. I'm really excited about it and want to be supportive.
No, I love that. And you worked for a little bit with Kirk Schaefer, right? While you were at AAA, is that correct? Or was that around that same period of giants you worked with?
Yes. So let me finish answering your question about NBA versus AAA.
Oh, sure. I'm sorry, I thought you were done. But then we'll get back to Kurt. You're so interesting. I'm just going to, I could add, let me ask you about the MiG. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
Yes. So ultimately, there are associations that focus on various areas of the industry. And in aviation, especially in general aviation, we have a good number of those between, you mentioned AAA, we're talking about here, NBAA, NATA, National Air Transportation Association. There's EAA for experimental. There's GAMA, General Aviation Manufacturers Association, representing the manufacturers. And VAI, Vertical Association in Aviation International, representing helicopters and eVTOL, AAM manufacturers and those in that industry. So there's something for everyone. NBAA has a unique role that we get to represent the business aviation industry. And so when I mentioned what business aviation is about, the listeners can only imagine as to all the disciplines in aviation that we touch. Obviously, the core could be seen as the flight departments. A number of companies, most of the successful companies in the U.S. will have aircraft as part of their fleets or rely on their airplanes and helicopters in some way. And so those will be the flight departments. And then those who are providing charter operations or fractional, Part 135 charter, Part 91K for the fractional, are all members of NBAA, but then we also have fixed base operators. We have manufacturers. We have those who do maintenance on the aircraft, the MROs, and everything in between, those who create interiors, who create flight planning software. All of that is part of business aviation. And of course, big emphasis on airports. Airports are members of NBAA, and your airport, Jeff, is a very active airport. We appreciate that. Chicago executive, of course. Ultimately, without airports, we would not have a place for companies and individuals to house their aircraft, and we would not have places for them to go to conduct business. The beauty of business aviation being so successful in the United States is the number of airports that we have and their proximity to the destinations on the ground. That's why business aviation works so well and is such a time saver. You can take off from an airport close to your place of business or close to your home, and then land at a location close to your destination for a meeting, manufacturing plant, or whatever your goal be, transporting an organ, getting it close to the hospital, all of those things. So NBAA represents all of those areas. AAAE has the airport focus and focuses on the airport professionals as well as issues that are impacting airports nationally. All of our associations work on Capitol Hill. We work with the FAA. We work with EPA, TSA in the various ways. And I'm proud to say that most of our work is very collaborative. We build off of each other. If we are working on an area where we both have common stake, a lot of times one of the associations that has the more prevalent role will take the lead, and others will support and either sign letters or participate in meetings, Capitol Hill or at the FAA. And so together, we're all one aviation community and are all successful.
No, I think that sums it up really perfectly. I think, on our end, as an airport user, especially, here in the United States, you talk about how much connectivity we have comparative to other countries, and kind of some of the other conversations we've been having about the United States in general and people coming here to learn to train. Part of that is obviously the portfolio of airports that exist here. And, I do appreciate all the advocacy, because I'll say as a user of airports and then working in airports, there's a lot of protections that are given. I mean, in the United States itself, most airports are run by some form of a government entity, whether that's a county or city, but most general aviation airports don't produce revenue to be self-sustaining. And so, there is that warning light on all the time of trying to protect those assets and come up with creative ways that they're not necessarily a burden to local taxpayer communities, because quite honestly, that's a lot of the times when you start to see, I don't say a target on an airport, but where local communities could try to figure out what they maybe want to do something different with the local airport, and all the examples you just pointed to. But with the advocacy to keep these resources available, because once they're gone forever. And so I really do appreciate what you do in the other organizations to keep people flying and keep these resources open.
Absolutely, and that's a really important part of my job. The primary focus is to protect access to airports, to help advocate for those airports and protect airports. You very astutely pointed out that most airports would not be self-sustaining without the support of the users, and of course the federal grants and the state and other grants that we have. That is a really robust system of funding that our airports rely on.
No, absolutely. So back to this MiG. No, I'm kidding. What I was asking, though, is Kurt Schaefer, just because I've met Kurt myself, and I think as far as one of those giants that you worked with in your time, you worked with him as well, correct?
I worked with Kirk when he was at the FAA as the Associate Administrator for Airports, and I was at AAAE at the time. So I certainly learned a lot from him, but also got to see a way that we could overcome challenges and do some really great things. Kate Lang was another giant She was the deputy assistant administrator for the FAA. She was there for many, many years and spanned many associate administrators. Ultimately, she was in the staff role while Kirk and a number of others were in the political role. As administrations changed, that number one position, the leader in the highest executive in the FAA Office of Airports changes, but Kate was the constant. And she had great knowledge, she had great strategic vision, and really brought a lot of success to the FAA programs and initiatives.
Yeah, I think Kurt. I've talked to Kurt before, and I think his claim to fame is he is the only person to serve in that role for 2 different terms. I believe is what his.
Correct. He was there during the George W. Bush.
Okay.
And then he was also there for President Trump's first term.
And
he came back after President Obama was president in that after that gap.
Sure. No, yeah, and he has shown. I know he runs a consulting firm now, but he has the world's smallest business cards, and I've talked to him about it. They almost are about the size of a fortune cookie strip of paper, and it's memorable though because I even remember it now. And he said it was all his wife's idea to make them so small that it would become a focal point to remember who he was, and it did. I was like, oh, okay, and you know what? I was just looking for his number the other day, and I was like, where did I put that fortune cookie paper? It's around here somewhere.
That's funny that you mentioned that because I've never gotten his business card.
Oh, really?
Having known him for so long, I've always had him in my phone.
Yeah, that seems fair. I can't be as personable as you and get all these contacts, Alex. I have a Rolodex. I put my business cards and my Rolodex next to my fax machine in my so from AAA to NBAA, is that correct? With a stopover in open air, is that correct? Or are you flying with open air?
Yeah, so AAA, I went over to ATCA, the Air Traffic Control Association, kind of getting the DC Association bug. ATCA does technologies and represents companies like Lockheed Martin, where I was working before AAA, and Boeing and Raytheon, a number of others that do the air traffic control technologies. And when I was transitioning, it gave me the opportunity to start my own company to contract back to AAA and to make sure that I provided continuity to a number of conferences and initiatives that I was doing. I wanted to make sure that the General Aviation Conference was successful, as well as a number of workshops. And during that time, I realized how excited I was to be an entrepreneur, to have my own entity. And I saw that I had something unique to offer to airports and to small technology companies. So ultimately, I ended up doing that full time for about 6 years, where I worked with small technology companies and helped them develop their products, help them bring their products to market to various airports. And then if they were at airports, I helped do some of the training and provided support. So really crossing all of my worlds, my technology world, my aviation and airports world, and the business aviation world, because I was doing all of that, flying my airplanes, still continuing to make sure that I entered the airport's airside, not landside, as much as I could.
That's pretty unique in our industry, I will say. As much as I would love to fly places too, just doesn't work out a lot of the time. So I do envy the fact that you actually can use the system that you're champion for. And so with NBAA, you've been there since 2015. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. Getting close to 10 years. And
congratulations. Awesome.
Thank you. It was a real privilege that when my predecessor announced that he was retiring, that they thought of me as the next successor based on what I was doing with airports and the flying, how entrenched I was in business aviation. I was very flattered by that. I also learned about a number of challenges that were facing airports and facing aviation. And I felt very empowered to join an organization like NBAA. And we talk about how powerful these advocacy organizations can be. And I got to be on the front end of that. fighting for Santa Monica, fighting for East Hampton, and so many other airports that need our help, that need the advocacy, that need the strong support of a group like NBAA to continue to be accessible to business and general aviation.
No, absolutely. And Santa Monica itself, it's right now. I know I think the community is looking at alternatives to the airport, but is that 2028? Is that when they could potentially close Santa Monica?
That's right. The challenge with Santa Monica at the moment is felt like we were successful in finding a way to preserve the airport long term. In 2015, when I started, the airport just came out of a very successful 30-year agreement that was made back in the 80s. And we were looking at how do we find a way that the airport can be successful and coexisting with the community. And by the way, if you're looking for an airport with various challenges, Santa Monica has examples of all of those, almost. One of the biggest ones is encroachment. We talk about land management. Unfortunately, Santa Monica has homes really up to the fence. And so it's understandable how challenging it is for some of the community members who are not as in love with aviation as we are.
Yes.
Did not grow up on an Air Force base like I did with MiGs flying over their homes, to have business aircraft flying over. So I thought we were doing really great in terms of finding a path to move forward. But unfortunately, the city and the FAA has made a covert agreement without consulting any of the aviation associations in the back room, so to speak. And that deal is what created the current environment in Santa Monica. Essentially, it shortened the runway to 3,500 feet from 5,000 feet. So eliminated a lot of the jets and the business aviation utility that airport had. By the way, it is an aviation system. And so now we're seeing impacts of that at Van Nuys, Burbank, Whiteman, a number of other airports that have Hawthorne that have pushed aircraft out. But they also, to your point, that settlement also created the requirement for the city to operate the airport for the next 11 years until 2028. Now, it doesn't say that it must close after that. It's just that the requirement to operate as the airport ceases. And currently, with the vote that took place back in 2017, when the settlement agreement was implemented, the airport is on autopilot to stop aviation operations at the end of 2028. There's a big effort, the Santa Monica Aviation Association, the Spirit of Santa Monica. There's a number of aviation organizations and groups, as well as, of course, NBAA, AOPA. I can mention all the organizations I've mentioned. We're all working hard to change its trajectory because ultimately it is a valuable airport to the LA area. It's very unique. Its history goes back over 100 years. But ultimately, that settlement agreement was a real game changer. Prior to that, the airport had an obligation in perpetuity,
right,
meaning forever, through something called the surplus property deed because of the way that it was improved during World War II. A number of airports, fortunately in the U.S., have that requirement for their preservation.
Right.
So it's a very, very powerful requirement.
Yeah, living in the Chicagoland region, first thing I hear, and like I said, it's edification sometimes with people when you have these conversations, especially if they're not in aviation, that just close the airport. And unfortunately in Chicago, there's a prime example of one that closed overnight. So a lot of times you hear,
very unfortunate.
Yeah, don't tell me you can't close the airport. They did it at MiGs. But I know in this case in particular, it's, for me, especially in this industry, it sets a precedent, right? Another precedent of a facility that if they do close, that again that lost its protections somewhere along the way, and like I said here, with what happened with MiGs, that's something that people they don't forget about when if they're having that conversation with you about closing the airport. But So with your, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to, absolutely. Airports are part of the national system.
Yeah.
And so what happened at MIGS could have repercussions at other airports. And the FAA has since changed the rules and made it harder for airports to close.
Yeah, no, I do fly over MIGS quite often. Most people that I take up that don't fly often, they want to do a city tour, so I'll point it out where it used to be in downtown Chicago. But at NBAA, your runway and surface safety has recently been in the spotlight as well. You're pretty involved in those areas, or are you not? Runway safety.
Very much, very much so. So that's another area of focus for me is runway and surface safety. And for those who may not intricately know what that means, runway safety is essentially anything that has to do with operating on the runway. At towered airports, you have to have clearance to be on the runway, both for vehicles and aircraft. And if one of those or both of those happen to end up on that surface without the clearance, that can be a problem. It could be procedural, or it could be deadly, essentially, if it could create impact. Surface safety also involves landing at the wrong airport or on the wrong surface. For example, taking off or landing on a taxiway or on the wrong runway. And there's a lot of airports with confusing geometry. And a lot of the coastal airports have runways that are aligned the same way, and they're just a few miles apart. So it's not unprecedented for aircraft to land at the wrong airport.
Oh yeah, no. So, do you work with the FAA at all for their? You probably know the names escape me. Of their spotlight videos they do for safety, like
from the flight deck.
On the flight deck, yes. Do you work with them on those publications and production of those videos?
Very much so, and thank you for asking, because that gives an opportunity to highlight one of the products. That is the arrival alert notices. That's something that the group that I'm working with, the surface safety group, that I am currently having the privilege to serve as the industry co-chair on, has developed about 3 years ago. And at first it started as 11 arrival alert notices for 11 airports that had the most challenges with surface safety. And now it has expanded to nearly 50 or so. They're available in the chart supplement. They're available in ForeFlight, and essentially provide a from the flight deck view of the airport with confusing geometry labeled. So I mentioned Reed Hillview earlier. Reed Hillview has one, and for those that take a look, it talks about where the two parallel runways are. It also highlights where the taxiways are to make sure that you don't confuse the taxiway with the runway, but also points out the highway near the airport, because during certain lighting conditions, it can become confusing and look as a parallel runway.
I've actually watched some of those videos here at Chicago Executive. Actually, we have one for runway 3034. And so no, they're very well done and very informative. So thank you for taking the time to put those together, because they do actually really help someone like me flying into one of these facilities. So thank you for all you do there. So at this point, we're going to stop with our conversation with Alex Gertsen, which is part 1 of a part 2 series. Alex gets a part 2 series because he has been so captivating. I kept him on the podcast way longer than I should have. I could have talked forever just about the MiG. The fact that he sat in the cockpit of a MiG is fascinating to me. But Alex has such an amazing story. He's doing so many other things in aviation. So please tune back in next week to Destination Aviation to hear what else we have to talk about with Alex Gertsen. And in the meantime, I told you I would get to some of the questions that I've gotten in. So I will at least get to one, because this podcast has already gone long. So typically I just go with first names, but this person in particular said use both first and last. He wanted it. So Ron Salone, your question was, have I ever been in a tri-pacer? I haven't actually been in one. I've sat in one, but I haven't flown in one. My brother actually was in a tri-pacer once, and he went up for the 4th of July, and they actually went over the top of some fireworks displays in the tri-pacer, and he loved it. He had a really good time. And so I hear nothing but good things about the tri-pacer. But no, I had a great time in Atlanta, had my presentation there, got to talk with a lot of different students from a lot of different colleges. There's actually some that have shown some interest potentially at coming onto the podcast and talk a little bit about their journeys. But I had such a warm welcome in Atlanta, so one thank you to my peers. Gave out a ton of podcast stickers, so I really appreciate everybody listening. Our last episode with Derek Martin, I think he's turned into a bit of a minor celebrity. Not anything to do on my part. It was all Derek. He said, I didn't say. He said he has a face for radio. But I disagree with him. I think he has not only the voice for radio, but a face for television. So I really appreciate it. Appreciate the warm welcome. If you do want to be on the podcast, or if you have ideas for the podcast, or you just want to share your story or have a question, again, I know there's others I haven't gotten to, please drop us a line at dapodcast85@gmail.com. That's your location for all things Destination Aviation. I got my GoPro ready to go, so probably do a little flight here soon. Throw it up on the YouTube channel for all of you to enjoy, make fun of, whatever you want to do once that's up there. But I appreciate returning listeners, and I also appreciate if you're new to the podcast. I really appreciate it. I know some people have asked for some solo episodes and some stories potentially, and somebody submitted an actually really good story to talk about on here. So I will try to get one of those up as well. And we also have some really good interviews coming up, along with the second part with Alex Gertsen. So without further ado on this episode here, further ado, I don't know either way. We'll talk soon. And until next time, my friends, I'll see you down the runway.